I don't know if we have the volume.
No one's talking yet. Or no one's talking yet.
What?
Nobody's talking yet.
Why, I'm not sure. We will have.
You're not sure what?
I'm not sure we will have volume.
Well, there's nobody speaking.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
Mute us. Mute us.
What?
Mute us.
Just wait till we hear someone.
Hello, Arnie. We can't hear anything else other than you.
Hey everyone, this is Jay hosting at Beth Emick, and you won't hear anything until the speaker begins because only her microphone is live here. So don't be concerned, you'll be able to hear her as soon as she starts. Thanks.
Here's Los Angeles. And Santa Monica. That's much nicer. Yeah, I have that. Okay, all right, so then, right away, you know, you got that valley, and you got the same neighborhoods right away, which is an amazing place, 10,000 feet. You can snow ski in the morning, and water ski in the afternoon, in the ocean. Yeah, that's amazing. I'm so not familiar with yeah, we'll go, make sure you go skiing on Mount Biale. Yeah. I'm doing so you and Dan. Most important is. Yes. I've been on the board because I went for this place. I'm coming in from the fourth year. Joyce, one real Dan and I, they're fakes. So our this mailing list that we have were send all the events and everything. And I'm getting them also from the Eventbrite, they send other things as well. So you have both Dan and Joyce on that list as well.
Okay, if you have got.
You know, she's one of those.
But you go down, part. And gave it to our next it's actually the guy who did mine. And so you can but then when you know, when you go to register for the event, you go find some taking on other events or other, so check on other chapters. You can check that you want to say our events for this other local drama.
And I'm not real sophisticated on this stuff, but correct me if I'm wrong. That if you've got connection on your phone, you know, if you've got email or the web on your phone, then you can read those messages from you and Eventbrite on your phone. Wow. So you know, I know you don't like when you put computer anymore, but you can get that information on your phone. Yes. Oh, thank you, Liz. What do you say?
We'll send your things in. And
So you
okay. And please, help me, because I know I did it wrong when I was talking to Reba. It's Biale. Biale. Like the two letters, B, L, yeah. Okay. I nobody gets it right. Nobody gets my name right either. So, you know, we're fair enough. Huh? Yeah, get a little. All right. Greetings. Thank you. Welcome, both online and in person. My name is Liz Suffet. I am the VP of Adult Programs and Education here at Congregation Beth Emek. And I'm really excited about this this evening. Rachel Biale was born in 1952 and raised. I'm supposed to say that.
I'm sorry, it was on your website. Raised in Kibbutz Kfar Rupim by the bank of the Jordan River. After serving in the Israel Defense Forces, she came to the United States and to earn her Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts degrees in Jewish history from UCLA and a master's degree in social work from the Biale School of Social Work at Yeshiva University. Rachel is a clinical social worker. She has worked as a therapist, specializing in families and young children, and has had a parenting counseling practice for over 30 years. She's also worked as an adult education program director, teacher, and community organizer. Her first book, this was pretty exciting to read, Women in Jewish Law, published in 1984, is considered a groundbreaking work in Jewish studies and remains in print now. Her newest books are her, almost newest book is her memoir, Growing Up Below Sea Level, a kibbutz childhood, as well as a parenting advice book. She's been busy because in addition, she has published 3 children's books as author and illustrator, 1 in Hebrew, 2 in English, as well as writing a parenting advice column for the for Bay Area Jewish community newspaper. She's also an artist. She writes and illumines Jewish marriage contract, Kibbutzot, and has illustrated her children's books and her parenting advice books. Sounds like I need to catch up on your bibliography for myself. And without further ado, Rachel.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, it's a delight to be here. those of you on the internet and those of you here, I really appreciate people actually schlepping in person to come here. And I hope that you all have some questions. How many people here served as a volunteer in a kibbutz a little while ago? Oh, this is interesting. This is unusual. So that's good because you don't have any firsthand experience to tell me that it wasn't like that. I do just want to add that I'm sorry, I apologize, but I have published 2 other books since then, one together with David, my husband, which is a kind of a sequel to this book, because this book ends pretty much when I leave the kibbutz at age 20, after having married this guy, this Los Angeles Jew, intermarriage, a Los Angeles Jew and a kibbutz girl. And then we met in 1970, and we corresponded for nearly 2 years, 258 love letters. So we wrote a joint memoir called Aerograms Across the Ocean, a love story in letters, which is both portions from the letters that kind of capture what it was like to be a student at Berkeley in the early 70s, and a kibbutznik, and then in the army in Israel at the same time. And we were both very engaged in Jewish identity and culture and politics. So it's kind of a snapshot of that time. But it also gave us an opportunity to kind of meet ourselves 50 years later, and sometimes cringe a little bit, and other times sort of very surprised by how insightful occasionally we were. So it's a kind of both the letters, but also a conversation with ourselves 50 years ago. And I also published a historical novel called Lost and Found, which is based on a true story of a family that was on the immigrant boat with my parents coming to Palestine in 1940. So I have copies here if you're interested. What I wanted to say in addition to all of that is that I also am the director of New Lair House, and I hope some of you have heard about New Lair House. We resurrected the old Lair House Judaica after it was suddenly announced just over 2 years ago that it was closed. And I hope that you come to our classes because we have an incredible array of topics, from the very serious and academic to the more entertaining. Almost everything is online, so you don't have to drive. And we also record pretty much all of our programs. So there's a library of maybe 120 videos by now that's completely available to you on our website. So enough self-promotion and New Lair House promotion, and let me start by telling you how this book came about, why it's growing up below sea level, and then I'm going to read one story. Almost all the stories are very, very brief. They're little vignettes that are sort of strung along like pearls on a necklace. Some of the same kids that I grew up with appear in multiple stories. Sometimes they're the center of the story, sometimes they're a marginal character, but you sort of feel like, oh, I met you 3 stories ago. I remember you. You were so-and-so. So the way that this book happened is that I had a few stories of my childhood that I told my children and my friends, because people were very curious about what was it like to grow up on a kibbutz back in the day of the Bet Yeladim, of the children's house, where the children slept in the children's house every night and only spent the afternoon and early evening with their parents. So I had a few sort of iconic stories, and I was telling them over and over again. And at some point I thought, you know what, maybe I'll write a couple of them down to hand down to my grandchildren. Well, I wrote one story, which is the story I'm going to read to you. That was the first story. And it was like opening one of those outdoor faucets, or maybe even a fire hydrant. It just poured out like story after story after story. When I had all the stories together, I worked with an editor and I said, well, what should I do with these? And we talked about different structures, and she said, you know what? Just arrange them chronologically. Don't make it hard on the reader, because it's already quite a lot of new information, just do it chronologically and make sure that they sort of follow your life. And then she said, and you really need to explain your parents' story, because the people who don't know the history of Israel and the history of the kibbutz movement, who will hopefully read this book, are going to say to themselves, what is with these crazy people coming up with this child rearing system? They have to understand the story of European Jews who escaped by the skin of their teeth from Nazi occupied Europe. In the case of my parents, they grew up in Prague. They were in the youth movement, which enabled them to go leave Czechoslovakia, go to Palestine. Arriving in Palestine, I'm going to give you just the 2-second review, but it takes a little section of the introductory part of the book. They arrive in Palestine. They leave Prague on December 10th, 1939. And they take a train to Bratislava, where they're supposed to go on a boat down the Danube to Romania. And one thing leads to another, and they're detained in a detention camp for 8 months. Finally, the following September, they get on this boat, they go down the Danube, they get to Romania, they get on a cargo ship crammed with 1,500 refugees, and they head to Palestine without certificates from the British government to enter Palestine legally. They are caught by the British near Cyprus. They're towed to the Haifa harbor. 3 ships had left Romania at the same time, my parents' boat and 2 others. And then they lost track of each other very quickly. When they arrived in Haifa, they found out that the 2 other boats had already arrived 2 weeks earlier, and all the passengers had been taken off those 2 boats and put onto a very large ship, ironically named the Patria, homeland, and were going to be deported to Mauritius. My parents were 19 and 20, so they were young people. So they were waiting their turn to be taken in a small patrol boat from the boat they came in to this ship, the Patria, when it exploded. It exploded and it keeled over and began to sink in the Haifa harbor. There are about 2,600 people on board, about 260 people drowned. So my parents were lucky that they hadn't been their turn yet to get onto the Patria. All of the passengers who survived the explosion and all of the passengers, like my parents, were taken to a detention camp. And about 10 days later, it was announced that everybody who had been on the Patria and survived the explosion was going to be allowed to remain in Palestine legally as a humanitarian gesture. So now my parents' good luck had turned bad, because a week later they were in fact deported to Mauritius, where they were imprisoned. My father until 1942 and my mother for the duration of the war. Finally, after all of that time, they arrived at the kibbutz where I grew up. And by then the kibbutz was already established. They weren't the first people to come there. And by then it was pretty much universal, with 1 or 2 exceptions, among all the kibbutzim in still Palestine, of course, because we're now talking about 1946 when my parents arrived at the kibbutz. They all had this collective child rearing system where the children lived primarily in a children's house. In other words, they slept there. From there, they would go to school, come back from school, have lunch, rest, work in the afternoon, and then at 4:30 in the afternoon, we would be sent home to our parents' room, which, by the way, was not more than a room. So that's why we called it the room, because it was, my parents had maybe a room and a half and an outdoor and a bathroom outside. And we would be with our parents from 4:30 until roughly 7:38, depending on our age, when they would take us back to the children's house and, you know, get us in our pajamas, brush teeth, read us a quick story or sing a song and leave. And then the metapelet, the caretaker, would come and make sure that everybody was quiet and, as far as she was concerned, asleep. And then she would leave. So by now we're talking about maybe 8:15, 8:30. So this scene that I'm describing, I'm in kindergarten. So we're 4 years old. The metapelet thinks that everybody is asleep. Everybody pretends to be asleep. She leaves. We know that at around 10:30 or so, a member of the kibbutz is going to come and sleep in the kindergarten, just in case a child woke up in the middle of the night, which we did a lot. I did, I know. But there was like a free-for-all from 8:30 to 10:30. And there were all kinds of Olympic sports of jumping and crawling, and there had a part during the day where they were telling us about the origins of mankind and cavemen. So we tried to make fires with flintstones. Fortunately, we failed, etc., etc. So I have one story about those shenanigans, which I'm not going to read today. And when I showed it to my mother, she was still alive then, she reads it and she says, "What were we thinking, leaving you unsupervised for 2 hours every night?" Anyway, so that's the general background. So let me just stop and see if there's any questions on that. Yes, please. Mauritius is an island in the Indian Ocean, about 200 miles due east of Madagascar. It's a beautiful tropical island where Napoleon built a jail for his political opponents. So it's a massive basalt rock prison, and then after World War I, for reasons that I don't exactly understand, it was part of the handling that was going on. It was first Dutch, then it went to the French. Then that's when Napoleon built the prison there, and then the French traded it to the British after World War I. It became a British colony. And there was a big prison standing there empty. And the thinking was the British were trying to prevent Jews from Europe from coming into Palestine illegally because of the tensions between the Jewish community and the Arab community and the so-called white paper, which restricted Jewish immigration. Yes, so the British thinking was, let's deport 3,600 Jews who came in illegally and imprison them, then everybody will get the message and they'll stop coming. So my parents were deported. About 1,500 people were deported to Mauritius and imprisoned there. The men in the old Napoleonic prison, and the women, they actually built barracks adjacent, and the men and the women were separated, and initially they were allowed to mingle once a week, and then they loosened the restrictions. There was more back and forth, but they had a little kibbutz there, if you will, in the sense that they had a hospital. Was staffed by, the head of the hospital was a British doctor, but most of the doctors and the nurses were from among the refugees because there are doctors and nurses among them. They had all kinds of craft workshops. They had a vegetable garden. They put together a school for the children. My father got out of there early because in 1942, the British gave the young men the opportunity to volunteer for the British Army. As Czech citizens, there was a free Czech unit within the British Army. So my father, and basically all of the young men in this youth movement group that my parents were in, volunteer. He went with the British Army first to Egypt. And then after the Battle of El Alamein, where the Nazis were defeated in the western side of Egypt, he was transferred to Palestine. If we have time later, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But there was one other question. Right. So when I was growing up, there were about 220 adults and about 120 kids. With different periods, it kind of shifts. But that was considered slightly smaller than medium kibbutz. Oh, and why below sea level? Because it's on the Jordan River in that big rift that goes from the Sea of Galilee, all the way from Syria, all the way to the Red Sea. And of course, the lowest point is the Dead Sea. And my kibbutz is at 225 or 228, I have to look it up, meters below sea level. And where we were growing up, I have to say that was our pride and joy. We were so special to be below sea level. Anyway. Okay, any other? Okay, so let me read this short story. Okay, I'm just finding it. Okay, I think I skipped it. It's earlier on. What is it possible that there's an here? It's the second story. I should just add that for some reason I have extremely vivid memory from very early on. My earliest memory is from age 3. And there's a story about that, which is the first story. And how do I know that I was 3? Because I know exactly in which children's house I was. If I went to the kibbutz today, I could tell you which room I was in and where my bed was, my crib was. And I know that that's where the kids go once they turn about 2 1/4, 2 1/2, they move from there to that room. And then at 3 1/2, they move to the kindergarten. So that's how I know. But this is in the 50s. So this is, so this is called Clean Sheets, and this happens when I'm in kindergarten, so I'm 4, so it's 1956, 57. Wake up, wake up. My blanket yanked off my face. I opened my eyes. In the fresh light of dawn, I saw Ronnie and Dalia pressed up against my bed. Why? What? It happened again, Ronnie whispered. It happened again, I repeated as I came around to full awareness. You know, to Sami, Dalia said. We never said the actual words. I got up quickly and smoothed down my blanket. Let's go, I said. We turned towards the far corner of the room where Sami was perched on the edge of his bed, hunched under his blanket. He was holding the ends of the blanket under his chin so tightly you saw only his eyes and half his nose. We were certainly efficient for 4-year-olds. We had plenty of practice. This happened at least once a week. Sami was the last one in our class of 11, 5 girls and 6 boys, who still had this problem. No one ever talked about it. Not the 3 of us who shared his room, nor the kids from other rooms who occasionally woke up early and saw us in action. Not the grown-ups either. Neither the metapelet, remember that's the caretaker, nor anyone's parents. Did they even know? Did Sami's parents know? Was there a conspiracy of silence or mere ignorance? I rushed to the anteroom leading to the showers, where clean laundry was kept in 2 rows of triple cubbies. The lower row was for bottom sheets, slip covers, and blankets, and slip covers for blankets and pajamas. I grabbed one of each. The second tier had 1 compartment for underwear, 1 for shirts, and 1 for pants, but I didn't need those now. I carried my bundle back to the room. I knew Ronnie and Dalia had already stripped Sami's bed by the smell in the doorway. Slightly pungent with a chemical quality I did not know the name for yet. Though it wasn't terribly strong, I experienced it as overpowering. Not in my nose, but in my heart. Shame on Sami's behalf. As if it were an entity standing there on its own right in the middle of the room. I put my bundle on the floor and without a word took the blanket from Sami's hands. Ronnie held onto the edges of the blanket while Dahlia and I tugged on the opposite corners of the slipcover. It was a hard job under normal circumstances for 4-year-olds. But with the large damp spot in the middle, it took all our strength. It was as if the wet patch didn't want to part from the cozy warmth of the blanket. Meanwhile, Sami stood to the side, shivering in his wet pajamas. I handed him the clean pair. Quick, I said, and put the wet pajamas on top of the wet sheets. I said as I turned back to help Ronnie and Dahlia drag the recalcitrant blanket out. Finally, the blanket released the cover, and Dahlia and I set to maneuvering it into the fresh one. Ronnie rolled the wet bedding and pajamas into a tight wad. Push it to the very bottom of the dirty laundry bin, I said as he dragged the wet roll along the floor by its only dry corner, heading towards the shower room. I know, he said, and make sure there is enough laundry on top of it so you can't smell it. I couldn't help acting as if I were in charge. A lifelong problem, by the way. I know that too, Ronnie said. I've done it enough times. He rounded the doorpost with the laundry. We better hurry, I said to Dahlia as we laid down the clean bottom sheet over the thin mattress, smoothing it across the middle. Yes, she said, we better finish before the others wake up. Or the metapellet comes, I added. Ronnie came back and helped us with the final tugs on the slipcover until the blanket was all the way in, and we managed to do the buttons that closed its open mouth. Sammy lay down on his bed and we covered him up. He was still shivering, so I tucked the blanket around him. Pretend you are asleep, Ronnie instructed everyone as we slipped into our own beds and pulled the covers over our chins. A moment later, we all heard the footsteps of the metapellet approaching the front door. Years later, when Sami was drafted joining a highly selective combat unit, I saw him after the first week of basic training. How is it going? How are you holding up? I asked. Good. It's not as hard as I'd been led to believe. The discipline, the endless push-ups, you know. Great. The first night, though, he stopped and his face got red. What? Sami hesitated and stared at his feet, shaking his head. Then he took a big gulp of air. It came back. The first night on the base. I could have used you and the others from our kindergarten room. Okay, so that story is a start. Any questions or reactions? Yes, go ahead. Not by selling wet sheets. Oh, yes, good, good. The question is, how did the kibbutz make money? So the kibbutz at the time, when I was growing up, was a purely agricultural affair. We had fish ponds. There's a lot of water in the Beit Shan. The kibbutz is in the Beit Shan Valley, which is about 20 miles due south of the Sea of Galilee, of the Kinneret. So it's an area with actually abundant springs. So there are a lot of water. So there were fish ponds. There were cows. Of course, you had to have a cow shed and milk the cows if you were a kibbutz. And there's a story in there about how in 3rd grade, they sent me out to bring the cows back home from the pasture at the end of the afternoon. We had pomegranates, olives, dates, some field crops. Yeah, that's about it. By the 1960s, almost every kibbutz found some kind of industrial project to undertake. Some of them were very fortunate, like Kibbutz Mishmar HaEmek, where David has family. They, quote unquote, invented those plastic wrappings of hay bales that you see all over the world. They're millionaires. My kibbutz, not so much. But it did have a factory that actually my father was involved in. And nowadays, The factory is shut down. Some of the field crops are still very functional and thriving, and tourism is a big, because of the Jordan River and the bird migration from Africa to the North Middle East and Europe, it's one of the best bird watching places in the world. And who knew there were so many crazy bird watchers in the world? So they have they have accommodations and they have tours and things like that. Yes.
Two questions. Do you have siblings, and was it any different between siblings and kids? Siblings?
Right, right. Yes, so almost everybody had siblings. Most families, when I was growing up, had 3 kids. Remember, these are all Holocaust survivors, mostly not people who have been through the death camps or even concentration camps, but managed to escape. With a few exceptions, there were some people who had been in the camps. There's a story about that. But most of the members of the kibbutz, like my parents, managed to escape. But they lost all of their parents, the grandparents, siblings. So, but at the same time, the kibbutz economically was still fairly basic. So most people had 1 or 2 siblings. I had 2 older brothers, so they were in other grades, obviously. So it was a kind of at the time, if you asked me when I was 10 years old, who are your primary people in your world, I would say it's the kids in my class. Those are my siblings. And yeah, I have older brothers, but they're in a different world. In hindsight now, no. In hindsight now, as I've evolved, clearly the nuclear family remained the key element in, at least in my growing up and developing experience. Yeah.
I don't remember. I was on a Kibbutz 75 Kibbutz, and I don't remember what the precursors were to Kibbutz 75, the movements that eventually formed that big movement. And I'm curious, what was Kfar Ru'im, or was it Hashemera?
Right. So there were.
What was their ideology?
Yeah. Good question. So there were 4 kibbutz movements. The smallest and one that is almost never mentioned, which I'll start with, is the religious kibbutz movement. So there's, I think, 8, maybe 8 or 9 religious kibbutzim. They're structured just like any other kibbutz, except that they are shomer mitzvot. They have a synagogue, which of course on my kibbutz, we do not have a synagogue. I first stepped in a synagogue at age 12 because for our bar and bat mitzvah, we didn't have a traditional bar bat mitzvah. We didn't know nothing about reading the Torah. We had 12 tasks that we had to complete that were seen as sort of gateways to maturity. So one of them was doing a whole shift with a night watchman, staying up all night. Big deal. Another one was working an 8-hour day on the kibbutz, because we worked every day for an hour or 2 in the afternoon, but to do a real work day, that was something. Another one, this is kind of funny, because this was one of the scary ones, was to go to the city on the bus with a list of 4 things that you have to buy. Little things for kibbutz members. Like I remember one thing I had was some kind of buttons. I don't remember the other things. But the whole thing of taking the bus by yourself with money, which we never used, and going into stores and asking for this button was a big deal. Along with that, there was also spending 2 days in a Hashomera Tza'ir kibbutz, which was much further left than our kibbutz. And the rumor was that boys and girls still showered together. So that was the big thing there. It turned out not to be true. They did share rooms, which in our kibbutz in 4th grade, they had a wing for the boys and a wing for the girls. And we did not shower together from 4th grade. In the Hashomera kibbutz that I went to, there was only one shower, but there was a turn for the girl and a turn for the boys, but they were in the same room. And the other one was to go to a religious kibbutz, which was literally 2.5 miles from my kibbutz. That's how close it was. I had never been there. I'd never been in a synagogue, and I was there for Shabbat. So I don't want to spoil it, but there is a story about that where how I almost got kicked out because after services and dinner, there was like an activity for the class that I was for the 7th graders. And it was the discussion of Parshat HaShavua. And the counselor said something like, what did God have in mind when he said blah, blah, blah? I don't remember. And one kid said this, and one kid says, and what about our guest? What do you think? And I said, it's a meaningless question because there is no God. So fortunately it was Shabbat, so they couldn't drive me home. It was too dark to just set me out and say, you walk home. Anyway, how did I get onto that? Oh, so that's the religious kibbutzim. Within the secular kibbutz movement, there were 3 branches. HaShomer HaTzair, which was the most farthest left, Stalinist until quite late. And in their system, the kids actually from 7th grade on actually lived in a kind of a boarding school and only went to see their parents once during the week and on the weekend. So that we considered that draconian. Then there was Hameuchad, which was not quite as extreme. There initially there was a big divide between whether the kibbutz should be a small intimate community or could be a large kibbutz. I'm not going to go into that history, but then eventually there was actually a split around position about Stalin because the stalwarts took a very long time to turn against Stalin. So anyway, there was a split between Hameuchad and Ichud was considered the most liberal, of the least doctrinaire, and that was my kibbutz. So how that translated in actual life is that in the 70s, some kibbutzim started to switch from very young children sleeping in the children's house to sleeping at their parents' house. So that first happened in the Ichud movement that my kibbutz was in, and then it gradually shifted. Nowadays, there's actually one kibbutz movement. It's a united kibbutz movement. And with the exception of some of the HaShomer kibbutzim where they still have this sort of boarding school for the teenagers, I don't think there's a single kibbutz where young children sleep in the children's house. But the children's houses still operate as a kind of a, if you will, after school kids club. And there's activities and there's counselors, etc. It's like daycare, but the big difference, which is a huge part of my childhood, is that after school, you come back from school, you have a snack, you have a rest, and then you work. So we started working in kindergarten already. So in kindergarten, the work was to help clean up the common dining room area, the bathrooms, help pick up toys out in the yard. We also had chickens, feed the chickens. In 1st grade, starting in 1st grade, there was a children's farm that the children managed themselves that had animals and a vegetable garden. And starting in 1st grade, you either worked in the children's farm or on a rotation, you worked in the children's house cleaning after ourselves. And by 3rd grade, we graduated to working in the real kibbutz. So that's when I got to bring the cows home from the field. And that was a very big, we thought we were the cat's meow. Yeah. Right. So it was only organic by virtue that the kibbutz couldn't afford anything better. So when I was growing up, we drank the milk from the cows of the kibbutz. I hated the milk. It always had this kind of skin on it. I couldn't stand it. And they made sort of fresh, simple, that gvina levana, white cheese. Fruits and vegetables, some were grown on the kibbutz, but the kibbutz is kind of limited because it's so hot there. So fruits would be brought from other kibbutzim, eggs from our own chickens, etc. So yeah, you could say that it was sort of ahead of its time, right? Everything was farm to table. But basically, when I was growing up in the early 50s, Israel was going through a very austere economic period, and food was scarce and very limited. So I have wonderful memories because I thought it was great. But for example, I didn't eat real jam actually made with real fruit until probably I was 12 or 13, because before that it was all ersatz, but we thought it was great. And one of my favorite memories, so when I was in kindergarten, there was some deal between the Israeli government and the American army. American army gave or sold at discounted prices surplus food, I assume from the war, leftover, those little butter patties, So they would only give that for the children. There wasn't enough for the grown-ups. There was a special treat for the children. On occasion, there would be more than we could eat, and there was not really a refrigerator, so they would send us home with one butter patty per child, except it was 110 degrees at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I put it in my pocket, and I ran home, and all that was left was a big stain by the time I got home. But we ate all our meals in the children's house. And then once we were in, if I remember correctly, 4th or 5th grade, again, a big privilege. We got to eat dinner in the big dining room. At first, there was a children's hour before the grown-ups, but then eventually we were allowed to eat at the same time as the grown-ups. It was a very big deal. And when I was growing up, the kibbutz, the way the dining room still worked is that there were these rows of tables, and they would come along with a cart with whatever was available that day, and they would serve each person. So there was a rule that when you came for dinner, you had to fill the tables, right? You couldn't, so it would be more efficient. But there are certain kibbutz members that nobody wanted to sit next to. So sometimes you would get to the dining room and there's like 20 people standing outside the door, and there's nobody inside. It's because Ubul is sitting at the 3rd table and nobody wants to sit next to him. Yeah. Yeah, so that's what, yeah, so you hit on the key issue of the story, which is kind of a dual thing. On the one hand, I'm a little bit like my mother, like, what were they thinking, making 4-year-old children be responsible for changing the seats and hiding the fact that this child was wetting his bed? At the same time, I'm kind of amazed by how thoughtful and cooperative and competent we were. And that's really a leitmotif for many of the stories, the sense of mutual responsibility that was drummed into us from very early age, which is that everybody in the group is responsible for the well-being of everybody else. Especially somebody like me who liked to think that she was in charge. So I grew up feeling a tremendous sense of responsibility for the other kids in the class. And I think that comes through in some of the other stories. And I think this boy who's in the story is no longer alive. And I never spoke to him about it, obviously. So that last part about the army is a little bit embellished. He did go into an elite unit, but it didn't really confide in me that he needed me. But I picked up that something happened to him. What was it like for him? you know, because if you grow up in a nuclear family and you wet your bed, only you and your parents and your siblings know. And, you know, then you have the problem of going on sleepovers. So you just say, I don't like sleepovers, and you wait until that problem is resolved. But here he has no buffer. He has no protection. At the same time, he knows that we will take care of him. And he must have been humiliated. He must have been humiliated.
Recording in progress.
Ah, he's a lucky guy. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So, I'm curious about the, what was the, you know, you guys had evolved this system of taking care of each other. What was the discipline and the expectations from the adults for the kids? You know, in terms of, okay, you're coming to adults now and you need certain manners, or, you know, you didn't finish your work, so what happens to you?
Right. So I would say that the adults, again, in hindsight and sort of comparing to, so as you mentioned, I was a parenting consultant for 35 some years. So I'm still doing parenting consultations. I still observe parents and young children. The expectations of maturity and responsibility placed on us were huge. And it's a double-edged sword, you know, it was quite a burden, but at the same time, it was incredibly empowering. So the sense that we can take care of ourselves is actually a wonderful thing that kids in this country today don't have. Perfect.
Influence your decision to go into something, parenting and childhood counseling? Do you find yourself that it's still?
Can you please repeat the questions?
Yes, I think, well, absolutely. So I would say that in many ways, I followed in my mother's footsteps. She actually started out as a metapelet. No, she started out as a nurse's aide, but she didn't like that. Then she became a metapelet, a childcare worker on the kibbutz. And pretty soon she realized that she was actually more interested in the kids who were struggling, finding ways to help kids who were struggling, either emotionally or intellectually. So already in the late 50s, very early 60s, she did a correspondence course with the British Institute of something or the other in psychology. And she said, you know, she went to the education committee and she says, you know, I have a kind of a talent for it. I'll work with this child who's struggling intellectually. I'll work with this child who we all think is struggling emotionally. And she started being a child therapist without any formal training. She never graduated high school even. And then she eventually became a therapist and worked in the kibbutz movement, had a network of child and family therapy clinics that she worked in. So that's part of it. And part of it that is, I think, for sure, the fact that I grew up this way and then I raised my children here. I just find it fascinating to do a kind of a comparison of cultures around child rearing. And number one. And number two, I think I bring a sort of a perspective that is helpful to parents of saying, you know, it's okay to have high expectations and your child should be working in something. They don't have to be it's not about making money. It's about having a job in the family so that they know that they're an essential part of the family working, and then doing something in the community so that they see that they need to work on behalf of the community, which, you know, is something that the Jewish community very much values and cherishes. And I bring that from my own childhood.
So follow up, and then I've been reminded that people online don't hear the audience questions.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. And do people in line have the opportunity to post questions in the chat? Okay, but maybe tell them that they can do that. Okay, thanks.
Differences of its learning styles, was that pretty accepted within the Kibbutz system? Or
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because the people who found, I'm sorry, was therapy or let's say an understanding the kids have different learning style and psychological issues that need to be addressed by the educational system, was that accepted? The people who kind of were the intellectual architects of this collective education system were well-trained in psychology. They knew Freud, they knew Adler, et cetera, et cetera. They were trying to create a non-toxic child-rearing environment because they thought the nuclear family was a toxic environment. And they have a point, up to a point. So I would say from early on, there was on the one hand, the sense like all kids are going to be treated the same. Everybody gets the same t-shirt and the same pants and the same shoes. But there was a realization from early on that some kids have psychological or developmental or intellectual issues that need support, and the job of the community is to provide that. So I would say that one of the benefits of the communal educational system is that kids who struggled for whatever reason were noticed very early on, much more so than, well, nowadays everybody is noticed, but let's say when we were growing up in the United States, who knew about learning styles or emotional issues? Everybody was supposed to go out and play on the street and do their homework. So I would say that the children with a psychological and developmental issue were noticed earlier on because they were also surrounded by somewhat more professionalized caretaker, so this system of therapy clinics was established already. I believe the first one was established in 1959 or 60. And of course, the services were free. We still got a ways to go to that. Yeah.
Okay, so sort of borders of
Right. So the question is, right. So the question is, does this communal child rearing in the whole communal way of living foster independence or thwart independence? And it's a very complex question, or rather the question is simple. The answer is very complex. Because in some ways it fosters independence sort of the way you saw in the story, which is that it provides children the opportunity to act independently and responsibly at a very early age. And it's a protected environment. So should they do something really stupid, like we did, usually the consequences are not serious. Because when I was growing up, there were no strangers. Everybody in the community knows everybody. So if you know, at age 4, we walked from the children's house to our parents' room alone. Unimaginable here. But that was partly because if I fell down, which I did a lot, because I actually needed glasses, and that took a while to figure out, there would always be some grown-up there to pick me up and to take me to my parents' house. And I knew them and they knew me. I would say where the system generally did not foster independence is more on the emotional level, which is that for the most part, I think most kids growing up, myself excluded because of the kind of parents I had, who were always often, they were really iconoclasts. So whatever the community said had to be done, they did something different. And I got the message, but the majority of the kids, I think, grew up feeling like you have to toe the line. You have to be like, you want to be like everybody else. You don't want to stand out as being different. And of course, for kids who were different for whatever reason, whether it was, again, abilities, either limitations or extraordinary abilities, or there was a kid in my class who, in hindsight, clearly was gay and probably trans, he had a terrible time. So if you were different, it was hard. And I don't think you were, the system really equipped you for feeling like I can go on my own way. Unless you had my parents, and that was unusual. Yes.
I have something of a broader question. Given your experience with the kibbutz and what you've learned about the kibbutzim in general, even in the period, I'm sure you keep reading about what's going on in these places. And given that we have such an autocratic movement going on in the world, and Israel, as I'm sure you know better than me, is absolutely no exception. What's going to happen with that socialist ethos that things like the kibbutz represent to people like me?
Yeah. So this is a big, hard question, which is what I'm repeating it. I'm shortening it. What's going to happen to the I'm interpreting your question a little bit. What is going to happen to the well-intentioned, beautiful, idealistic, socialist worldview that we treasured and is gone? So let me start by saying that the kibbutz movement as a whole has gone quite far from the way I was raised. It's much less collective. It's much less coercive. There's a lot more independence and freedom to make your own Shabbos. Most kibbutzim are privatized or semi-privatized, meaning if you work outside the kibbutz, let's say you are in high tech, but you want to live in the kibbutz because it's a wonderful place to raise children. Your parents are there, so you have grandparents. It's a beautiful agricultural kind of setting. You can work remotely most of the time anyway. You make a huge salary, that's your salary. You pay the kibbutz a monthly fee for all the services that you receive. But you might be making 10 times more than your neighbor who's still working in the kibbutz laundry. On the other hand, the wages within the kibbutz they're not equal, but there's no income inequality the way we know it here. So the highest paid member working on the kibbutz, let's say the person who manages the fish ponds, which are extremely successful this year, makes maybe 40% more than the person who cleans the toilets. And there's a tremendous safety net. So anybody who has a special need, whether it be physical, developmental, or mental, the kibbutz takes care of that. So you don't have to worry about that. So now the bigger question. I guess I would say that I'm kind of an optimist in the sense that I think that like all revolutionary movements, it went too far, and it just was not that kind of pure idealistic society. Just does not work with human nature. As they say in Seinfeld, people, they're the worst. Right? If you didn't have to deal with people, things would be easier. So the initial kibbutz did not allow for the variety of human nature, and also for the fact that when you live in a small community, little things become big things. So you need more physical and emotional space in order to live in a community. But I'm hoping that some kind of modified version that is not as alienating or autocratic or with the kind of discrepancies in income and power that we see, that will become popular again, maybe in my grandchildren's generation. Yes, and then, yeah.
Is it true that
most of the Israeli leadership for many, many years came from the kibbutzim as opposed to disproportionately from the kibbutzim?
Right. So the question is it true that most of the Israeli political leadership you're talking about came from the kibbutzim? It was true. It hasn't been true for a long time. Basically, it hasn't been true for, I would say, a generation and a half. So yes, in the establishment of before the state, establishment of the state in the 50s and the 60s, that was true. And then with the rise of the right of Begin, that diminished, and now what I would say, and then there was a lag time. It used to be that the elite leadership of the army was very heavily from the kibbutzim. That's also no longer true. So Israel has changed very, very drastically. But who knows? Maybe the wheel will turn again. Is there a high percentage of immigrants? So basically, all of the kibbutzim were established by immigrants. Question is which immigrants and when. So the initial wave of people who established kibbutzim were Russian Jewish immigrants, and then Eastern European Jews. And my kibbutz actually specifically was originally established by German Jews, and then with a big influx of Czech Jews. So the Czech Jews were not as rigid as the German Jews, so they softened things a little bit. There's very, very few immigrants from North African and Middle Eastern countries on kibbutzim, and even fewer from the former Soviet Union, because they have an allergic reaction to anything that seems remotely similar to communism. That said, what is Fania to be? My brother's mechutonim, it's actually kind of funny. So she is a Russian Jew who came fairly early on in the 80s, I think, married an Iraqi Jew, and lives on the kibbutz. And for quite a while, there was a group on the kibbutz of people who got together once a week to study Parashat HaShavua, which was interesting because none of them are religious and some of them are anti-religious. So this woman, Fania, is like virulently anti-religious, but she came to the group, maybe because my mother was in the group too. And my mother always, as my mother used to say, thank God I don't believe in anything. So she would come to the group to challenge what the Bible had to say, and Fania liked that. So, it's, but that it's very unusual. Mostly it's Ashkenazi Jews still, and their children and grandchildren. Okay, so the first question was, did I think the way I was raised was a good way to raise kids? And the second question, maybe related, when did you leave and why? So what I hope you'll get from reading my book is that the answer is complicated, which is there were some wonderful aspects. I would say, first and foremost, the amount of freedom that we had is staggering to think about compared to how children are raised here. We were basically they opened the door of the children's house and we went out. And even within the structure of school, every day in elementary, in the first few years of up until maybe fourth grade, every day one of the lessons was going on a tiul, on a walk somewhere on the kibbutz. We would go to see the cows, we would go to see the sheep, we'd go to see the kitchen, we'd go see the chickens. And that was part of the way we were raised. So I would say it was a much more holistic, and we had our own vegetable garden and we worked. So the connection to nature and to farming and the freedom to just go out the door and tell your parents you'll be back when it starts to get dark, was a wonderful thing. The responsibility, I think, as I said, is a double-edged sword. There's a sense of, first of all, I guess I would say I value the sense of responsibility as a value. I think that's a wonderful thing to grow up with. It's also quite a burden. It's sometimes a heavy lift. I think that for the parents, it was harder than for the kids. Because for a lot of parents, it was very hard not to have their kids sleep at home. And for some kids, it was very hard. So if you read, which I highly recommend, Amos Oz has a book of short stories called Between Friends, which is about childhood on the kibbutz. And there's one story there in particular that will just tear your heart out about how hard about a specific child who is kind of ostracized by the other kids in the class, and how terribly, terribly painful it is for the child and for his parents. So for some children, it was very hard. For me personally, it was wonderful. Why I left is a very complicated reason, which has to do with love and wanting to study at the university in the United States. I'd been in the United States for a year in high school, at Newton High School in Boston. And it had a huge impact on me. It was like, I'd come from this tiny kibbutz. Even though my parents were very worldly and cosmopolitan and had friends who would visit from all over the world and read very widely, were extremely cultured, Central European Jews. Nevertheless, the kibbutz was a tiny little pond. And I went from there to Newton High School, which at the time was considered the best public high school in the country. Maybe Berkeley High was just as good. And it was mind-blowing, and it was the civil rights movement, and it was my introduction to sort of thinking about racism. So when I came back to the kibbutz, it sort of planted the seed that I wanted to do my university education here. And then along comes David and makes that possible, and a few other good things. So I wanted to study here. I wanted to have the experience of living on my own. Of course, I'd never lived independently. And then by the time I finished my university education, we had a life together. After a couple of false starts, we basically came to the conclusion that we would stay here. So then that would mean raising my children here. And that may be part of the reason I got interested in child rearing professionally and did some training in it and gave it a lot of thought as to how I want to raise my children in this environment, but with some of the values that I grew up with. And I think I succeeded, actually. Yeah, so there was some bullying. It was usually a kid from an older class. It didn't happen within our class. We were a small class. We were 11 or 12. What I would say is that everybody had their place that they were pegged into. It was very hard to break out of your spot. I was in a very good spot. Which, as I said, was great, but also meant I had to take care of all these other kids who were lower down on the totem pole. There were some kids who were very mean and bullying, but they usually were from an older class. And then we would band together and try to protect whoever they picked on. But there wasn't the kind of bullying that I read about that happens here now.
I want to thank you, Rachel, for a fascinating glimpse into this story and your story. I still have 1,000 questions, but
Okay.
we'll take it. Yeah. Yes.
And in light of that, I do want to say that we have Judy Wheeler from Town Center Books here again tonight, selling copies of the Growing Up Below Sea Level. And also Rahel brought some additional of her other, some of her other books that that Judy will sell for her. I want to thank the Contra Costa JCC for co-sponsoring this talk with us. And thank you guys for being online and being patient, and thank you for here, and thank you so much.
And let me just say that if anybody has a burning question, you're welcome to email me. I have a website, rachelbiale.com. It's got some information there, but you can contact me through the website. I'd be delighted to answer any other questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.